Watsonian Ejected. From A Time of Love and Tartan by Alexander McCall Smith. When Matthew returned to the gallery after 20 minutes at Big Lou's, he found Pat reading at her desk. He glanced at the book. "Anything interesting?" he asked. "It's just something I picked up. There was a book sale at Holy Corner. They had all sorts of stuff." Matthew tried to look over Pat's shoulder, but she turned the book over, unhelpfully exposing the back cover. "All sorts of stuff," he echoed. "I love those sales. I go to that one in George Street. They get thousands and thousands of books each year, all sold in a good cause. Lots of the books are quite new. I bought Guy Peplow's book on Samuel Peplow there last year." "Yes," said Pat. "My father gave me a copy of that." Matthew decided to be direct. "So, what's this book you're reading?" He hesitated, as one had to be careful with Pat. "You seem a bit defensive, if I may say so. You aren't reading that 50 Shades, are you?" Pat gave him a withering look. "Do you think I'd read something like that?" Matthew shrugged. "A lot of people seem to have read it. Nobody I know of course, but..." Pat looked at him scornfully. "I was only joking," said Matthew, smiling. "Chakun asungu, each to his own taste," he said. He was open-minded, but he blushed at the memory of something that had happened to him. He had seen the controversial book in a bookshop and had taken a furtive look inside. Unfortunately, a woman had come up to reach for another title from the shelf immediately in front of him, and Matthew could not replace the book without her seeing it. What would she think of him if she saw him flicking through the pages of 50 Shades? It hardly bore thinking about. She would think he was one of those people who went into bookshops and flicked through the pages of the latest salacious offerings until the staff eventually rumbled what was going on and asked them to leave. The shame of it. The public humiliation. He imagined the headline in the evening news. "Watsonian Ejected from City Store." They would be sure to mention that he was a Watsonian, because they would want to make the most of that. No, that's absurd, he thought. Nobody cares anymore what other people read. Prudery and disapproval are things of the past, even in Edinburgh. And then, in a moment of heart-stopping awfulness, he recognized the woman standing beside him at the shelf. It was Mrs. Patterson Cowie, his old English teacher from Watson's. She it was who had introduced him, as a boy of 10, to Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses, and to Kidnapped. From A Child's Garden of Verses to books about, well, about the sort of things 50 Shades was about. Not that Matthew imagined that anybody actually did any of the things described in such books. Why would they? Perhaps there were people who had nothing better to do. For a few moments, an eternity in his mind, Matthew remained immobile. It could hardly be worse, he thought. Or it could be, perhaps. It could have been the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland standing next to him. The moderator would turn to him and say, "I'm so disappointed in you, young man." Or, worse still, say nothing but register his disappointment in his look. And Matthew would blush deep red and mumble, "I'm doing research, you see." Or perhaps, "I thought this book was about interior decorating." It's very misleading, don't you think, to call a book 50 Shades of Grey when it's not about interior decorating at all. The moderator would agree, but then he might say, "But what is it about?" That would be problematic. He decided to act. Mrs. Patterson Cowie gave no sign of recognizing him. He thought that perhaps she had not actually seen his face. That was a relief. He could now sidle away from her, taking the book with him, and she would be none the wiser. He took a step backwards. She was still preoccupied with her scrutiny of the shelves and paid no attention to him. He took another step, but found that he could not retreat any further in that particular direction, as his way was blocked by a display stand for a new cookery book. Nor could he move to the left, where a door said, "Staff only." Well, that did not apply to emergencies, of which this was one. He could go through that door, wait until the coast was clear, and then emerge once more to replace the book where he had found it. He edged sideways towards the door. He kept his face turned away from Mrs. Patterson Cowie as he pushed the handle. It gave easily, and the door swung open. He did not turn around to see if she had noticed him. Matthew found himself in a corridor, empty apart from a few tattered pieces of paper on an old notice board. At the other end was a second door, towards which he now made his way. This second door was locked. There was a keypad beside it that would open it, but one would need a code. He tried the handle several times and even applied his shoulder to the door itself, but all egress was barred. He felt his heart begin to pound. He would have to go back the way he came. He returned to the door through which he had entered the corridor. It was locked automatically from the other side. Matthew took a deep breath. Had he missed something? There must have been a lock that had been triggered once he pushed the door open. Perhaps. He stopped. There was no point in searching for explanations of his plight. The inescapable fact was that he was trapped in a corridor that was, to all intents and purposes, a cell. He leaned against the wall. He would have to think very carefully. It seemed to him that this was some sort of emergency exit for staff who, presumably, would have been issued with a code to get out through the second door. He looked about him. The corridor had a dusty and neglected look to it. People probably only used it during fire alarm practices. He could be there for days, unless he called for help and somebody heard him. But who would hear him? He had been in a corner of the shop, away from everything else. No, he was trapped with only one book to read. He suddenly realized then that the walls of his cell were grey, monotonously so.